With this session update, I'm Shannon Lurkey. During a meeting of the State Government Finance and Policy and Elections Committee, members considered a proposal to amend the Minnesota Constitution to alter how a future vacancy in the Lieutenant Governor's office would be filled. Currently, the President of the Senate is elevated to fill the position. Here's that portion of the meeting.
Senate File 57 is a fairly simple bill. I think most of us are aware with the concept, and it deals with would be amending the Constitution of Minnesota to change a constitutional amendment back from 1972. Until that time, Lieutenant Governor served as president of the Senate, and the Senate did not elect its own presiding officer. In 1973, the Senate elected its first presiding officer, and that officer served for 3 years before there was an opening in the Lieutenant Governor's position, and that person was, under the new constitutional provision, automatically became Lieutenant Governor. That individual, Lieutenant Governor Alec Olson, served for a couple of years. He lives in the Wilmer area, I believe in Spicer. And I tried to reach out to him. I had heard from somebody that he was never happy about what happened to him. He loved presiding in the Senate, and he was very disappointed to be pulled out there. This didn't come up again until a few years ago when Senate President Michelle Fischbach was moved, I believe she said against her will, to become Lieutenant Governor because the Constitution called for it. I don't see this as a great way to do it, and I've talked with, I think many of you have as well, with our current Senate President Jeremy Miller. I don't think he would welcome the being expelled from the Senate and serving as Lieutenant Governor, but that's what the Constitution calls for. This amendment would simply have the governor make the appointment for a Lieutenant Governor. That's the way most states do it. It's the way the federal government works after the 25th Amendment, where the President of the United States would appoint a Vice President, and as we would do here, the governor would appoint a Lieutenant Governor. And I don't know that I think there's some fairly strong bipartisan support for that. The one thing that I wanted to open up for the committee to consider is how we as a Senate play a role in that. There are several approaches for the confirmation. The bill had one that was just a rough one, but I had two approaches, an A1 and an A4 amendments that I would like to discuss in a minute, but also wanted to mention that Senator Ann Rest had introduced a bill that would be parallel to the federal process. Under the 25th Amendment, if there's a vacancy, the president nominates a new vice president, and then that person shall take office upon confirmation by a majority vote of both houses. Our confirmation, our advise and consent provisions in our Constitution call for it to be a Senate responsibility. I don't know that that's the appropriate way to do it. Senator Rest's bill would also, and I wanted to put that out there so people have it aware as an option. We could include the House, and that under her bill, if we're not in session when the governor makes the appointment, because we want this to be able to take effect quickly, she would propose that we have a special session, and then both houses would come in just for confirmation or rejecting of a nominee for Lieutenant Governor. I would propose two amendments. I'm going to offer two. I will actually propose one of them, but just to spell out all the options, the A1 amendment, which I believe is in your packets, would take the—
Senator Marty, before you proceed, let's be sure that that is the case. So, Mr. Bjorn, will you confirm that these amendments have been posted and distributed? You're mute.
Senators, that's correct. Both amendments have been posted to the website and sent to you. If for some reason you don't have them, please email me and I will get them to you as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank
you, Mr. Bjorn. Senator Marty, you can proceed.
Okay, thank you. And the A1, these are different amendments. I'm just throwing them out there for the committee's consideration. The first one would just allow the governor to make the appointment without any advice and consent, with the the basis for that kind of thing would be that the governors basically pick their lieutenant governors anyway. They all do pick them, but the difference in the normal process is that after they pick their nominee for it, then the voters elect the ticket. I think the gubernatorial candidate has 99% of the reason people vote for the ticket, but the voters, if the person was so inappropriate, the voters could vote against them. So this would not have that voter approval, but this is one other option I wanted to throw out there, and that is that the governor could make the appointment with no confirmation. The second approach, the one I would like to have offered as an amendment, is the A4 amendment, which would simply have that when there's a vacancy, the governor would nominate, would appoint, in effect, would appoint his or her choice for serving as lieutenant governor. And in doing so, the appointment, they would begin serving immediately, but would only serve if they were not rejected by the Senate. And the Senate in that way would be similar to the process we have it now, where a candidate for a nominee for commissioner or a state agency head, we have the ability to confirm, and they serve until and unless they are rejected by the Senate, meaning we have a floor vote and they do not get confirmed in the floor vote. They do not have enough votes for confirmation. So this would basically try and take that process, but it would put in a timeline, because I think for a lieutenant governor, because many cases, lieutenant governor might have no responsibilities other than being first in line of succession. I don't know that it's a healthy thing to leave this hanging there. So what this proposed amendment would do would be that they would serve as lieutenant governor unless rejected by the Senate, and the Senate would have to make a decision within a 30-day period of time, or if we're not in session, within 30 days of when we next meet, either in regular or special session. Again, as I mentioned, you could go with the approach of Senator Rest's bill, where you would call a special session to do it, so it happens right away. But I'm not sure. I mean, to me, it didn't seem like it was worthy of a special session just for that. And that since I think we recognize that a candidate for a governor is going to pick somebody they feel comfortable with working with. I like the idea of us having the advise and consent, but I think it should be within a period of time. So I would ask that you consider the A4 amendment, but in any way, how we do this, I don't think, I think any of you who watched what happened in the last few months with Senator Miller stepping down because he really did not want to leave the Senate, and having watched that 3 years earlier with Senator Fischbach, I don't think that's the way we want to do it. It leads to political game playing, understandably. Both sides are trying to protect their members and gain members and everything else, and that's not serving the Senate well. So to me, this is a simple amendment. I believe it would have strong voter approval, but we do have the one question of how one should deal with confirmation. And so I would encourage the A4 amendment, but I offer these three options just so you see the full range of what's out there.
Thank you, Senator Marty. Members, just for your information, this bill, I will be laying it over for possible inclusion, but my position in hearing it today was to be able to have this kind of a discussion. So at this time, it's open for questions of Senator Marty or any other comments, and I'll first go to Senator Osmick.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Senator Osmick.
Great. Senator Marty, first off, I fully agree with the need for the bill itself. I disagree with adding the other body in the confirmation process for a number of different reasons. Most importantly, because they're currently not part of any of the confirmation processes right now. And I don't think letting that camel's nose under the tent is a good idea. But that being said, I do have concerns over the not having a special session or triggering a special session, because This is a very important position. The lieutenant governor granted, as some people said, the vice president of the United States is basically a caddy or other derogatory terms. The lieutenant governor is a heartbeat away from being the leader of the state of Minnesota in the executive branch. And I think that certainly is important enough for the Senate to be called back in for a special session to confirm that, or to go through the confirmation on the Senate floor. I'm sure we would probably, unless it was someone that was wholly unqualified for whatever reason, I'm sure we would probably just confirm them. But I do have concerns that we don't do that for the following reason. The way the amendments are written, and you can respond to this then, the way the amendments are written, it's entirely possible that the lieutenant governor could resign or be appointed to the United States Senate or whatever the case might be. And then the new lieutenant governor is appointed by the governor. And let's say that 2 days later after the appointment, the governor gets hit by a bus, God forbid. Then the lieutenant governor who's already there is already been appointed, would ascend to becoming governor without that confirmation process, the way I'm reading this. So I guess I'll let you respond to this. I'm sure that's not necessarily your intent, but I do think that having a confirmation, a shot in the Senate is very important to this process. And I'll let you respond.
Thank you, Senator Osmick. Senator Marty?
Madam Chair, thank you. Yes, Senator Osmick, I agree with you, one, about the importance of getting this right, and two, about there being a Senate confirmation. I certainly, when I was thinking about special session just for this, I was picturing some people saying, well, yes, but I have no objection to that. I think the idea, my main point is it should happen quickly. And I think 30 days within the appointment would make sense. And that could easily, this A4 amendment could easily be done just to change, or if their Senate legislature is not in session, that the governor should immediately call one for within 30 days. I do think that that's an appropriate thing, and your scenario, which is an unlikely one, but these unlikely things do happen in time. And once we put something in the Constitution, we want to make sure it's right. So I'd be very favorable to changing it so that the 30-day period, would happen even if we're not in session at the time.
Thank you, Senator Marty. I think it illustrates the point that there's a lot of details and facets and ways to look at it, to consider it. I think the general interest sometimes is to have things, but which direction do we go? So other members for questions, comments, Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Senator Marty, I agree with some of Senator Osmick's concerns, and one being, unless rejected, just because of how we've seen, and certainly I would also object to including both chambers being part of the confirmation process, just because of what we've seen with the politicization of the emergency powers, so rather than fall into that, I think there has to be an affirmative vote rather than just a negative vote, and I would encourage consideration of that.
Thank you, Senator Pratt. Senator Marty, would you like to respond?
Madam Chair, Senator Pratt, yes, I don't disagree with it. The negative vote means, but in other words, the one suggestion that I think that Senator Osmick made that I guess I didn't respond to directly, and that is that the candidate, the nominee, would begin serving before this. And I'm fine with if it's within 30 days,
Yep.
I'm fine with the idea of having it be that upon confirmation, and that the Senate has to vote on it within 30 days. If we're going to go through the step of having a special session, we can do it as fast as we want. And in that case, I don't have any objection to the idea of the nominee not taking office until we confirm them. But so that would be a simple way, and Ms. James, I'm sure, could easily draft it. But yes, I'm not pushing for the idea that they have to take office right away. I'm pushing for, I was concerned if we were going to have them wait until January of the next year, we have no lieutenant governor for a half year. But if we're going to have a special session, it makes sense to do it right away and not have them take office until confirmed.
And
Thank you, Senator
Sarah.
Marty. Senator Pratt.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. And Senator Marty, I agree. And I guess that was the scenario. If the person is serving, then it would be a negative vote by definition. So thank you for clarifying.
Thank you, Senator Pratt and Senator Marty. Ms. James, did you want to weigh in here on something?
Madam Chair and members, I think that in light of the conversation, I think Senator Rust's bill, Senate File 887, gets close to what you're asking for, although that provides, as Senator Marty discussed, advice and consent of both bodies. So we would just take out the role for the House of Representatives. But I think then this would accomplish what you're describing you'd like to see.
Thank you, Ms. James. I don't know if we're at consensus yet. I think it's a very debate kind of a situation, and I appreciate that information. Senator Carlson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm trying to get my head around this. How many things we're trying to do here? We're trying to establish succession, which I fully understand, and I know that we have to do something like that. But then we're also trying to establish a confirmation of a person taking a new position. And I'd like you to think about something here that maybe is not included in our thinking, and that is, Senator Osmek said, what about the governor getting hit by a bus? Well, what about if that happens and we have the lieutenant governor taking the position of governor, and then we need to replace that person with another appointed person? Would we have to confirm that person? And would we have two people who have never been actually elected as individuals in those positions for a short period of time? So I'm concerned about that 30 days. If that person has not been confirmed, or if there's some other language in there that doesn't put them into the position of governor, how will we deal with that? Certainly the governor, or let's say the outgoing governor, could call a special session, but could that outgoing governor, who has now been, is now deceased, would not have the power to call a special session? So I think there might be something that we need to make sure that this person that is being pushed into the new position has earned that position one way or the other, or is automatically given those powers in a case like that. I mean, we don't have that problem today, even though we don't like the succession. But I think what we need to do is make sure that we get this really clean. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Carlson. I think that's the goal, is to have a discussion today, so we might move along that direction. But the one thing that it has shown me in the discussion today is quite a bit more complicated than we would think, and especially when it's in the Constitution. So that's something to carefully consider. Well, with that, members, thank you for a very robust discussion. Thank you, Senator Marty, for bringing the bill forward. Glad to have had you with us today. With that, members, I will lay Senate File 57 over.
To continue following these issues and more, watch legislative coverage Monday through Friday on the PBS Minnesota channel, or visit our website, www.senate.mn/media.